Norfolk Southern knew the Avtex siding switch was defective. Railway workers had filed reports. Safety inspectors had documented concerns. Maintenance requests sat in pending files. But schedules mattered more than switches, profit more than safety, and at 2:43 a.m. on January 6, 2005, that calculation killed 9 people and poisoned an entire town when engineer Christopher Sealing's train hit the faulty switch at 47 miles per hour and slammed into 90 tons of chlorine. The switch banner at milepost 187.6 had been problematic since installation. Not visible from 342 feet where crews worked. Not illuminated at night. Not monitored by dispatchers. Just a manual lever in dark territory where human memory was the only safety system. 28-year-old Christopher Sealing had dreamed of driving trains since age 7. Friends said he lived and breathed Norfolk Southern. Kept his phone on even off-duty, hoping for calls to get back on a locomotive. On January 6, 2005, that devotion would kill him. The setup had been building for hours. Train P22, a local freight, spent January 5 switching cars at the Avondale Mills siding in Graniteville, South Carolina. The crew wasn't the regular assigned team. Both the conductor and engineer had the day off. Standby employees filled in, men less familiar with this specific track, less familiar with this specific switch. They worked their 12-hour shift. Federal regulations meant they had to be off duty at 7:53 p.m. No exceptions. As the clock approached their limit, the crew rushed to finish. Secure the locomotive. Clear the track warrants with dispatch. Get off duty before violating hours of service laws. The brakeman threw the switch to let them onto the siding. When they finished, he was supposed to throw it back to mainline position. He didn't. Later, speaking to National Transportation Safety Board investigators, he admitted uncertainty. Quote, "Not 100% sure I aligned the switch for mainline operation. I might have made a mistake." Unquote. Nobody checked. The switch sat 342 feet from where they parked. Invisible in the darkness. No visual reminder. No mandatory verification protocol. No form to fill out confirming position. The crew contacted dispatch at 7:53 and 7:54 p.m. to clear their track warrants. Dispatch had no way of knowing the switch remained lined for the siding. The switch banner pointed the wrong direction. A silent trap waiting in the dark. Meanwhile, Christopher Sealing was beginning his run. Norfolk Southern Freight Train 192 departed Macon, Georgia, heading for Columbia, South Carolina. 42 cars trailing 2 SD-60 locomotives. Among the cargo, particle board, industrial clay, steel coils, sodium hydroxide, Cresol. And 3 consecutive 90-ton tanker cars filled with pressurized liquid chlorine. Chlorine at this concentration is a weapon. Used in World War I to kill soldiers in trenches. 1 breath of concentrated chlorine gas causes immediate respiratory collapse. 2 breaths guarantee death. The tankers rolling through Graniteville contained enough chlorine to create a kill zone measuring miles in diameter. Sealing's train approached Graniteville around 2:38 a.m. Maximum authorized speed through this section was 49 miles per hour. He was running at 47. Exactly 2 miles per hour below the limit. A careful engineer following the rules. The track ahead curved slightly left near the Avondale Mills complex. In the darkness, under weak moonlight, Sealing scanned forward as trained. Then his conductor saw it. The switch banner. Lined wrong. Quote, "The target is wrong." Unquote. Sealing's last words before impact. He hit the emergency brakes. Air pressure dumped. Steel wheels locked against steel rails. The physics were merciless. A train traveling 47 miles per hour requires roughly half a mile to stop from emergency braking. The switch was 566 feet ahead. 8.4 seconds. That's how long Sealing had to process what was happening. To understand he was about to die. To watch the parked locomotive materialize out of the darkness directly in his path. At 2:39 a.m. exactly, train 192 hit the misaligned switch at 47 miles per hour. The locomotives lurched left onto the 8-degree curve leading to the siding. The sudden turn derailed the first freight car immediately. It rolled right, uncoupling from the locomotives but dragging the rear of the second locomotive off the tracks. The 2nd through 14th cars progressively derailed. They piled into a growing mass of wreckage, metal screaming, steel tearing, couplers snapping. 2 more cars derailed but stayed clear of the pile. Then the locomotives plowed into train P22's locomotive at combined closing speed. The data logger recorded standstill at 2:39 and 20 seconds. 3,520 tons of steel stopped in just a few feet. The impact was catastrophic. Both lead engines of train 192 derailed completely. 16 of 42 freight cars destroyed. Train P22's locomotive thrown off the tracks. And among the wreckage, 3 tanker cars carrying chlorine. The 9th car in train 192 was a pressurized tank car containing 90 tons of liquid chlorine. In the collision, a coupler from the 11th car became a lance. It punched through the tank's steel shell like paper. The breach measured roughly the diameter of a dinner plate. Through that hole, 60 tons of liquid chlorine began escaping. Liquid chlorine under pressure flashes instantly to gas when released. The sudden vaporization created a cloud approximately 3,400 feet by 2,200 feet. But something unexpected happened. The rapid release cooled the remaining chlorine through a phenomenon called auto-refrigeration. The escaping gas drew heat from the remaining liquid, cooling it enough to slow further vaporization. 30 tons remained in liquid form. Still deadly, still escaping, but slowly enough that the full catastrophe took hours instead of minutes. Had all 90 tons vaporized instantly, the death toll would have been in the hundreds. Auto-refrigeration, an accident of physics, prevented total annihilation. But it still created a kill zone measuring over half a mile in diameter. And the weather conspired to make it worse. January 6, 2005, was nearly windless in Graniteville. The chlorine cloud settled into the valley along the tracks rather than dispersing. Graniteville sits in a natural bowl. The poison gas pooled like water, trapped by geography. Heavier than air, hugging the ground, a yellow-green fog of death that wouldn't leave. Christopher Sealing never escaped his locomotive. The impact had crushed the cab. Chlorine flooded in through shattered windows. At 2:40 and 11 seconds, just 71 seconds after impact, the conductor radioed dispatch. Quote, "We went through a misaligned switch. Hit a locomotive. Need help." Unquote. The conductor was injured but alive. He could smell the chemicals. See the gray-white cloud forming. Sealing and the conductor tried to move downwind, away from the growing gas cloud. But Sealing had been closer to the breach. Inhaled more. He was already dying. First responder Brian Napier found him staggering in the fog, gasping. Quote, "We've had a head-on collision. We've got a chemical leak. I can't breathe." Unquote. He collapsed. Napier's window was open for seconds. Long enough for chlorine to flood his vehicle. He choked, made a U-turn, sped away on instinct. Found himself a mile east with no memory of driving there. Sealing was rushed to the hospital. He died hours later, 28 years old, doing what he loved, killed by a switch that should have been monitored remotely but wasn't because dark territory was cheaper. The chlorine cloud spread faster than anyone could react. It traveled only 200 feet before reaching Avondale Mills. The textile plant sat in a natural valley. Large ventilation systems designed to cool machinery. Those ventilation systems sucked in the chlorine like lungs inhaling poison. 183 people were working the night shift. Most never knew what hit them. An Avondale employee called 911 48 seconds after the collision. Emergency dispatch recordings captured her confusion turning to panic. Quote, "Something happened. I went outside to investigate but I can't tell what. I smell smoke. "I gotta get out of here." Unquote. The call abruptly ended. She survived. Barely. 6 Avondale employees didn't. Willie Charles Sheely, 43, a third-shift supervisor and National Guardsman, heard about the chlorine leak and directed his energy toward helping others. He moved through the plant shutting down machinery, getting people out. He was found dead with John Laird, 24. The two men were discovered arm in arm, apparently trying to help each other when the gas overwhelmed them. Fred Rusty Rushton III, 41, a boiler operator from Warrenville. Colleagues said he knew his job inside out and would help anyone who needed it. Found dead at his station. Alan Frazier, 58, from Ridge Spring. Found in an office in the Gregg Division. Stephen Bagby, 38, originally from Germany, now living in Augusta. Had become a father 10 days before the crash. His relatives described him as, quote, "a man who gave of himself in ways that were pure of heart." Unquote. His newborn would grow up without him. Willie Lee Tyler from Macon had been with Avondale since 1968. 37 years of service. Found dead in the plant. Workers who escaped described horror. Carl Gartman told the Augusta Chronicle he saw, quote, "a yellow cloud coming at us." Unquote. Made it to the parking lot before, quote, "started coughing and spitting up all different kinds of stuff." Unquote. He survived. Many around him didn't. Joseph Stone, 22, a Canadian trucker known on CB radio as Rolling Stone, had arrived the afternoon before to pick up a load. Decided to sleep in his cab overnight rather than find a hotel. Save money. Get an early start. The chlorine cloud entered his sleeper cab. He died in his sleep, suffocated by invisible poison. Tony DeLoach, 56, a Vietnam veteran and retired Graniteville company employee, lived on Main Street near the crash site. Known as the Shrimp Man for selling shrimp locally. The gas cloud reached his home before he could evacuate. He died in his house while thousands fled around him. The Graniteville-Vaucluse-Warrenville Volunteer Fire Department headquarters sat 500 feet south of the crash site. When the call came through, responders headed toward the scene. They drove directly into the chlorine plume. 3 firefighters were overcome immediately. 1 remained in critical condition for days. These were men wearing protective gear, trained for chemical emergencies, who had practiced scenarios exactly like this after September 11. The chlorine didn't care about their training or their equipment. It took until 2:56 a.m., 17 minutes after impact, for responders to learn the cars contained chlorine. 17 minutes of people rushing toward the scene without gas masks. 17 minutes of residents opening windows to investigate the smell. 17 minutes of mill workers evacuating into the cloud instead of away from it. At 3:06 a.m., emergency notifications finally went out. Shelter in place. Close windows. Turn off air conditioning and heating systems. But the gas had already spread through half the town. More than 550 people flooded area hospitals complaining of respiratory distress, burning eyes, difficulty breathing. 75 were admitted for treatment. But the true impact on emergency departments was far worse. 263 people were examined within 24 hours. Of those, 146, over half, ended up in Augusta, Georgia, 15 miles away. At least 95 patients arrived in privately owned vehicles. The disaster overwhelmed facilities across state lines. People fleeing poison gas didn't wait for ambulances. They drove themselves, their families, anyone who could still breathe. Symptoms varied by exposure level. Those closest to the breach suffered immediate respiratory collapse, pulmonary edema, chemical burns to airways. Those further out experienced persistent coughing, chest pain, breathing difficulties that would last months. Medical teams discovered something terrifying. Chlorine exposure causes delayed pulmonary edema. People who felt fine hours after exposure suddenly developed fluid in their lungs 8, 10, 12 hours later. Emergency department physicians were warned not to discharge patients quickly. The gas could kill you hours after you thought you'd survived. Leonard Mathis, a brick mason from Graniteville, was driving home from a convenience store minutes after the crash. Passed through the outer edge of the chlorine cloud. Felt sick but made it home. His health deteriorated steadily. On April 21, 2005, 3.5 months after the crash, Leonard Mathis died from complications of chlorine poisoning. The 10th victim. By 3:30 a.m., authorities ordered evacuations. 5,400 residents within a 1-mile radius of the crash. Reverse 911 calls went out to 3,600 homes with shelter-in-place messages first. Turn off air conditioning. Close windows. Stay inside. Then at 4:20 p.m., over 12 hours after the crash, evacuation orders finally came. Decontamination centers were set up at University of South Carolina Macon and Midland Valley High School. Families walked through chemical showers, everything they wore declared contaminated. The evacuations would last nearly 2 weeks. Norfolk Southern's preliminary settlement with evacuated residents, $2,000 flat for the evacuation. Plus $200 per person per day of evacuation. Cold calculation. Quantifying displacement. Pricing out the inconvenience of fleeing poison gas. Meanwhile, emergency responders faced an impossible problem. 60 tons of liquid chlorine was still in the breached tanker. Another 46 tons escaping as gas over 3 days. 2 additional intact chlorine tankers sat in the wreckage, any shift potentially causing rupture. 1 tanker of sodium hydroxide. 1 of Cresol. A single spark near any of these could trigger explosions that would level what remained of Graniteville. The response team decided on a dangerous solution. Pump liquid sodium hydroxide into the breached chlorine tanker. Sodium hydroxide plus chlorine equals sodium hypochlorite. Household bleach. Less toxic. Removable by truck. Operations began January 7. Crews in full hazmat suits worked around the clock. By January 13, the 2 intact chlorine tankers had been unloaded, placed on flat cars, moved from the site. By midnight January 18, the unloading of the punctured tanker was complete. The tank was cleaned, purged, loaded onto a flat car for removal. The railroad crossing gates at the crash site had activated during the collision. They remained down, bells ringing, lights flashing, for nearly 2 weeks. Clang 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 clang. A metronome of disaster. Emergency responders weren't allowed to touch them. NTSB investigators had to rule out terrorism first. On January 29, 2005, just 23 days after the disaster, Norfolk Southern resumed train service through Graniteville. Reduced speed, 25 miles per hour instead of 45. As if slowing down would prevent another misaligned switch from killing people. When residents finally returned to their homes, they found the town transformed. Most houses survived structurally, but chlorine is corrosive. It had seeped into everything. One local church had to be completely rewired. Brass fixtures corroded, stained glass destroyed, entire electrical systems compromised. A woman approached cleanup crews asking what they'd done to her pool. It had been filthy, unused for years. Now it looked freshly installed. The chlorine cloud had sanitized it. Her pool was clean. Her town was poisoned. South Carolina Electric and Gas lost multiple power substations throughout the area. Chlorine had corroded critical components. At Avondale Mills, the damage was catastrophic. Chlorine concentration in the data administration building wiped out every computer. Machinery throughout the facility corroded beyond repair. Textile manufacturing requires precision equipment. Chlorine destroys precision. Total property damage exceeded $6.9 million. That number doesn't include lost wages, lost business, lost futures. It doesn't include the textile workers who developed permanent lung damage. Medical studies tracking the mill workers found significant reductions in lung function immediately after exposure. Some improvement in year 2. But the proportion of workers experiencing accelerated annual lung decline increased dramatically in the 18 months following the disaster. Their lungs were destroyed, slowly, measurably, permanently. And Avondale Mills, the company that had operated in Graniteville since 1845, that had survived the Civil War, the Great Depression, global competition, that employed thousands across the Southeast, closed permanently in 2006, citing the Graniteville disaster as the primary cause of failure. The Gregg plant had accounted for 40% of company sales. Quote, "We were prepared to weather the storm of global competition. What we weren't prepared for was an event such as this derailment, which was completely beyond our control." Unquote. Stephen Felker, Avondale's manager of corporate development. 2,000 Macon County residents lost their jobs. The town's economic anchor, gone. All because a switch wasn't returned to mainline position. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation concluded November 29, 2005. The findings were damning. Probable cause. Quote, "Failure of the crew of Norfolk Southern Train P22 to return a mainline switch to the normal position after completing work at an industry track." Unquote. Contributing factor. Quote, "The absence of any feature or mechanism that would have reminded crew members of the switch position and thus would have prompted them to complete this final critical task." Unquote. Translation. The crew made a mistake, but Norfolk Southern's system allowed that mistake to become catastrophic. The NTSB found no equipment failure, no crew fatigue, no drugs or alcohol. Just human error in a system designed to guarantee that human error would eventually kill someone. Railway workers had been warning about dark territory switches for years. Union representatives testified that manual switches without remote monitoring were accidents waiting to happen. That 12-hour shifts left crews exhausted and rushing at the end of their time. That lack of verification protocols made mistakes inevitable. Management had dismissed these concerns. Dark territory was cheaper than installing remote switch controls. Forms and protocols slowed operations. The railroad industry had been moving 3 million tons of chlorine annually, 37,000 tank carloads, through dark territory without incident. Why change? January 6, 2005, answered that question with 9 corpses and a poisoned town. After Graniteville, the Federal Railroad Administration issued Safety Advisory 2005-01. Urged railroads to review operating rules. Take steps to ensure crews properly positioned manual switches. It referenced rules already implemented by Burlington Northern Santa Fe and Union Pacific requiring crews to inform dispatchers of switch positions before reporting clear of main line track. 2 days after Graniteville, a BNSF freight train in Bieber, California, unexpectedly diverted onto an industrial siding and struck 2 loaded grain cars. 7 locomotives and 14 cars derailed. 2 railroad employees injured. This happened less than 3 months after BNSF had implemented the exact rules the FRA was now recommending. In August 2005, a Kansas and Oklahoma railroad freight encountered an improperly lined switch in Nickerson, Kansas. Entered a siding, struck standing cars. The pattern was clear. Advisory notices and voluntary rule changes weren't enough. Meanwhile, Norfolk Southern agreed to settlements. $215 million to Avondale Mills for damages. $4 million in federal penalties for Clean Water Act violations and failure to immediately notify the National Response Center. Payments to evacuated residents. Medical monitoring for exposed workers. But here's where the story becomes almost satirical. On May 24, 2005, less than 5 months after the Graniteville disaster, Norfolk Southern was awarded the TRANSCAER National Achievement Award for 2004. TRANSCAER stands for Transportation Community Awareness and Emergency Response. An award promoting emergency preparedness for chemical releases. The award recognized Norfolk Southern's emergency preparedness training in 18 of 22 states where they transport hazardous materials. Training nearly 4,000 emergency responders in 261 counties. They received an award for emergency preparedness months after their misaligned switch killed 9 people and sent 5,400 residents fleeing from chlorine gas. The company estimated the disaster cost between $30 and $40 million. A marginal stock impact of 5 cents per share. The company statement expressed profound sorrow, promised to do everything in their power to ease the pain. In legal filings, Norfolk Southern's defense attorneys argued that plaintiffs' quote, emotional evocations of deadly chemicals, mangled metal, or deadly liquid chlorine forming a gas that crept through Graniteville and killed those who could not outrun it, unquote, could serve no purpose other than to divert the court from legal technicalities. 9 people dead. Over 500 hospitalized. The company's lawyers complained about emotional language. 20 years later, Norfolk Southern trains would derail in East Palestine, Ohio, releasing toxic chemicals including hydrogen chloride and phosgene. The pattern continues. But here's what the official reports don't capture. The railway workers knew. They'd filed reports about switch problems. They documented that the Avtex siding switch banner wasn't visible from where P22 parked. They'd requested better lighting, remote monitoring, mandatory verification protocols. Those requests sat in pending files while management prioritized throughput over safety. While executives calculated that dark territory was cheaper than proper switch controls. While the industry insisted that voluntary compliance and advisory notices were sufficient. Christopher Sealing died doing what he loved because Norfolk Southern chose profit over protection. Willie Charles Sheely and John Laird died arm in arm trying to save their co-workers because ventilation systems sucked in poison gas that shouldn't have been released. Stephen Bagby's 10-day-old child grew up without a father because a switch that should have been remotely monitored wasn't. 5,400 people were evacuated from their homes. Over 500 needed medical treatment. 75 were hospitalized. An entire town's largest employer collapsed. Thousands lost their jobs. All preventable, all predicted, all dismissed by management until the yellow-green cloud proved the workers right. At the crash site today, a memorial lists 9 names. Christopher Sealing, Willie C. Sheely, John Laird, Rusty Rushton, Alan Frazier, Stephen Bagby, Willie Lee Tyler, Joseph Stone, Tony DeLoach. The memorial doesn't list Leonard Mathis. He died outside the 30-day reporting window. 10 victims. 9 officially recognized. The memorial doesn't list the 2,000 workers who lost their jobs when Avondale closed. Doesn't list the residents who sold homes at losses because property values crashed. Doesn't list the mill workers whose lung function never recovered. Doesn't list the railway workers who'd warned about dark territory switches for years before management listened. In 2023, 18 years after Graniteville, the Federal Railroad Administration finally issued a final rule requiring railroads to provide emergency escape breathing apparatuses to train crews working hazardous materials trains. 18 years. That's how long it took to mandate that crews carrying chlorine should have air supplies in case of release. Christopher Sealing didn't have one. It wouldn't have saved him. The impact was too severe, the exposure too immediate. But maybe Leonard Mathis, driving home from a convenience store, would have survived with a respirator in his truck. Maybe some of the first responders who drove into the cloud would have emerged uninjured. Railway workers had requested this equipment for decades. Management resisted. Too expensive, not proven necessary, until Graniteville made it undeniable. The story of the Graniteville chlorine disaster is the story of every industrial catastrophe. Workers identify the hazard. Workers document the risk. Workers request the fix. Management calculates that prevention costs more than probable damages. Until catastrophe proves the workers were right all along. Until the bodies pile up. Until the class action lawyers arrive. Norfolk Southern knew the Avtex siding switch was defective. Railway workers had filed reports. Safety inspectors had documented concerns. But schedules mattered more than switches. Profit more than safety. At 2:43 a.m. on January 6, 2005, that calculation came due. Christopher Sealing's locomotive is SD60 number 6653. It was repaired after the crash. Rebuilt as an SD60E bearing number 6900. Still running. Still hauling freight through dark territory where switches rely on human memory instead of remote monitoring. The industry learned enough to issue advisory notices and recommend voluntary compliance. Not enough to mandate the systematic changes railway workers had been demanding for years. Not enough to prioritize safety over efficiency. 20 years after Graniteville, first responders still refuse to discuss the disaster. Quote, "I don't want to open up that heartache within myself." Unquote. The trauma persists. So do the lung problems in former mill workers. So does the pattern of railway companies resisting safety improvements until after disasters force their hand. The yellow-green cloud is gone. The evacuations ended 2 decades ago. The wreckage has been cleared. But Graniteville remembers. Remembers the switch that wasn't aligned. The warnings that weren't heeded. The lives that didn't need to be lost. They dismissed the switch warnings until a 47-mile-per-hour freight train unleashed a chlorine cloud on a sleeping town. 9 dead, hundreds injured, thousands displaced, an entire community poisoned. All because management knew better than the workers who actually operated the switches. All because profit mattered more than proper safety systems. All because dark territory was cheaper than doing it right. The railway workers were vindicated. Too late to save Christopher Sealing. Too late to save the Avondale Six. Too late to save Joseph Stone and Tony DeLoach and Leonard Mathis. But vindicated nonetheless. The next time you hear about railway safety concerns being dismissed as unnecessary or too expensive, remember Graniteville. Remember that the workers who warned about dark territory switches were proven catastrophically right. Remember that management's calculation that prevention costs too much was paid for with 9 lives and the town's destruction. If you found this video informative, consider subscribing. If industrial disasters caused by institutional negligence interest you, we've covered similar stories. The truth about these catastrophes needs to be told. The workers who warned deserve to be vindicated. Graniteville, South Carolina, January 6, 2005. A misaligned switch. 60 tons of chlorine. 9 deaths. A town poisoned. The railway workers had warned them. Management didn't listen. Until the yellow-green cloud rolled through the darkness and proved them right.